Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name's Deborah Hatswell, and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Tonight, I will be sharing UFO and UAP reports that are spotted in the skies all across the UK. Our first encounter takes place close to Ferry Hill, and it happened in August of 2008. And our witness's name is Jane, and she said, "Hi, Deb. Last year, you heard my story about my strange encounter in the Cairngorms, where I had a possible brush with the grey man of Ben McDew. That report has affected me for nigh on 12 years, with no hope of ever coming to terms with it until I met you. Perhaps that experience affected me more because of an earlier incident, an incident which I would like to share with you now. 3 years before my experience in Dalrada, my world had been completely rocked by another experience which still haunts me every day. Back in the 2000s, like so many others, I realised a childhood dream by being part of a paranormal investigation team, and I got to stay at purportedly haunted locations all over the UK. It was an interesting time, a real privilege to gain access to historic sites overnight. I met great people in the process, lifelong friends. It was a blast. There I was in my 30s, doing what I dreamed of doing since I was a kid. In 2008, my friend got us a location in County Durham, and it was a haunted inn that had featured on a well-known paranormal programme. After the show had left, things had gone terribly wrong for the family there, and poltergeist activity had escalated. The landlady vowed she would never permit paranormal investigations of any kind there again. But my friend somehow managed to get permission off her for us, just a few of us to go, along and stay overnight. At the time, this was a huge win for us and our little group. You can imagine us, counting the days until we could get there. We were so excited. The day finally came. We were all in high spirits, EMF meters and recording equipment packed. We travelled south along the A1 towards our destination. Some of the group went on ahead in their car, and I travelled with my friend in her car a little while later. We chatted away about the night to come, which was all we could think of. However, as we were passing Newcastle, I looked over to my friend and I noticed something very odd in the sky off in the distance. I said to my friend, "Well, they're certainly not helicopters." And she glanced over and said, "Oh yeah, that's odd." From that moment, that formation of lights was clearly in my view. And even though they were miles away, it was obvious that there was something very strange about them. The objects themselves were unnaturally still. And although they were bright, they weren't giving off light as, say, the lights on a TV mast would, for example. They weren't flickering at all. Looking at them they just didn't seem real. It was like someone had stuck 6 bright, round orange stickers onto the night sky. It's approaching, say, 8:30 p.m. It's a Saturday night in August, bank holiday weekend, 2008. We're on the M1 motorway, and there's plenty of cars around. I mean, it's a main artery. The road's well lit. It was warm, dry. And as my friend and I are progressing along the A1, we're getting ever closer to these lights. The closer we get, the stranger this all is. After I'd been watching them for around 20 minutes, fascination soon turned to abject fear from me as we began to get within about half a mile of them. At this point, the motorway was about to bend around to the left, and from the position of the lights, it looked like we were going to drive very near to them. As the road straightened and the lights were in full view once again, to my horror, I saw that they were hanging low, just above a motorway bridge. And yeah, we were about to drive right underneath them, and there was no other way that we could avoid that. My friend said Shall I pull over so we can get our cameras out of the boot and take a closer look? And I was terrified. I said, no, for God's sake, just keep driving. And as we were about to drive under these spheres and the motorway bridge, I said, keep looking at the time. It's 8:45 p.m. It's 8:45 p.m. We drove underneath them, and as we did, I leaned forward, got close to the windscreen as I could. I crooked my neck to stare up at them as we passed underneath. They were completely spherical, no marks, just bright orange spheres, fixed in their positions, which had not wavered in the 20 minutes or so that I'd been watching them. I'm hopeless at heights and sizing, but they were just above, I'd say, the height of a house. And I would also say that each of the orbs would have been large enough to contain a large car or a transit van. I checked the time, and it was still 8:45 as we passed underneath them and the bridge. And I spun around in my seat, and I watched out the rear view window and kept them in sight for as long as the road permitted. We turned off at the Ferry Hill turning not long afterwards. By the time we'd met up with our friends at the haunted pub, we were in shock, I think. Well, at least I was. I couldn't believe what we'd just witnessed. We'd just been close to 6 UFOs hanging low over the A1. They were so close to the road surface, I'm sure I could have battered a tennis ball at them and I'd have hit them with no problem at all. My friends must have thought I was a lunatic. I was in such a hyped state, telling them like, bloody hell, UFOs are real. That night, I experienced a gamut of emotions. This was incredible. Wow, I'd seen the impossible. What I'd been interested in and had an open mind about since I was a kid had just been proven to me without the shadow of a doubt. They were real. I was amazed and in awe. But everything was about to come crashing down. In the days that followed, I went from a static high to a very low point. Amazement turned to fear. And then, which was even worse, I dropped down to a complete apathy. My whole world was turned upside down, and I clearly hadn't been the true believer I'd considered myself to be. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been reacting in this way. I just couldn't comprehend what it all meant. I questioned my religion and faith and came to the conclusion that nothing really mattered anymore. There was no point to anything. This awful feeling of being lost stayed with me for a long time. Nothing I knew or thought I knew made sense anymore. How could it, after seeing what I'd seen? The parameters of my world had been blown apart. I was scared, helpless. Life would never be the same again. And then, 3 years later, I have that terrifying experience while camping near Aviemore. And this one's even worse. It felt life-threatening, and in a moment I thought it was the end for me. The second experience tipped me over the edge. UFOs and now a monster. It was too much for one person to handle. And from that point, until I found you, Deb, I was deeply disturbed by those traumatic events. One would have been more than enough to cope with, but two, off the scale experiences, well, I'm only human and I just couldn't cope with it. Both experiences haunted my everyday life. I forever feared that something else would happen to me. It was around 2018 I started to listen to YouTube every morning before work. It took, about 10 years for me to be able to get a grip and start better educating myself on the subjects of UFOs and cryptids, not just in the UK, but worldwide. I learned a lot, and from this daily habit, it eventually led me to BBR, thank goodness. After listening to hundreds of hours of lectures and documentaries, I realised, as far as the UFO subject was concerned, there were similar reports out there, So I wasn't unique, and that brought me so much comfort. Finding you, Deb, and BBR really helped me to finally realise that I was not the only one who'd experienced the impossible. And I can't tell you how much of a weight that's been lifted from me. It's such a worry when you feel that you are the only one to experience something. That feeling of isolation made it feel like a target, you know? I lived in constant fear of what was going to happen next. A feeling of being in danger was always in the background. So what did I see over the A1 that night? Whatever it was, it defied our accepted laws of physics. Whatever they were they friends? You know, were they foe? Was it secret military tech or something from outside of our world? What I will never be able to reconcile is why there wasn't a huge car pile up on the motorway that night, or why cars had not pulled over to watch this spectacle. It doesn't make sense. Surely others saw them, or did they? So many questions. More importantly, I want to make sense of the link between these orange orbs and creature sightings. I've heard these two incredible subjects mentioned together many times, so they are not mutually exclusive. Although these experiences of mine are 3 years apart, is there a link here for me too? I hope this is a subject you'll explore sometime, Deb. If you're comfortable to do so, that is. It seems many of us experience both kinds of phenomena, and it makes me wonder why. I attached a really simple reconstruction of what we saw that night. This is the actual bridge. I think it's the last motorway bridge heading south of the A1 before the Ferry Hill turn. After this happened, my friend did some digging, and she found reference that someone reported seeing something on that night in Darlington, and someone else saw exactly the same thing a week later in Stroud. All of my life I've been a sky watcher. In the late 1970s, I stayed at my cousin's remote farm in Anglesey for a holiday. I think it was 78, something like that. I was in October-ish, and that summer there'd been a spate of UFO sightings and landings of craft on Anglesey. This was only a few years after the Berwyn Mountain incident, when Wales was still buzzing with UFO talk. I was about 7 at the time on this holiday. I remember my cousin telling my parents about how a UFO had landed in the local school, and the kids, who had been sent out to collect the milk, had kind of gone up to the craft, which was sat in the playground, and he touched it, and his clothes disintegrated. I wasn't meant to hear any of that story. The adults thought us kids were out of earshot. But I took in every word. I've never forgotten it. One of the days, during the holiday, I remember playing in one of the fields near the farm. It was only 100 yards away or so. We were playing, my second cousins and I, with a teepee. We set it up in the field, we were having a great time. It was a typical Welsh overcast day with dark grey skies. I do remember that day being suddenly consumed with fear, realising we'd wandered too far away from home. My 7-year-old brain worried that if something suddenly appeared in the sky, the grown-ups wouldn't hear us calling them for help. So in a bit of a panic, I said to my playmates, "Come on, we need to go back home," which we did. Thankfully, the two didn't question me. We went back to the farm and played around the house that day. The holiday stayed with me, and I've been a sky watcher ever since. Every night, me and my husband, are out with the dog. I'm always happy to get home, as I still expect to see something even now. I'm from Cardiff originally. We only moved out here to rural Monmouthshire in 2011 for a new job. These incidents I've been talking about to you happened hundreds of miles away, so that gave me comfort until I watched a programme which told of a similar UFO sighting just 10 minutes drive from me on the A449. at Monmouth. Around 2019, something suddenly changed around here, around my village, which worries me. I've seen some very odd things in the sky. But my husband, who's ex-army, just tells me to get over it, as this is a training area for the military. You know, the silly soldiers, as he calls them. We say yes. There is something definitely amiss in this part of Monmouthshire, Deb. I just don't want anything else to happen that will prove me right about that. I really do understand all of the questions that Jane raised and asked and the feelings behind them. These ordinary people see UFOs, UAPs, crafts, lights in the sky, and all manner of things. I've taken reports from a taxman. I've took reports from an employed dog walker. I've taken reports from, taxi drivers, delivery drivers. It's not people who are on, as they would say, on the, spooky range of things. It's everyday, ordinary people. And having an experience, no matter what that is with, is not as easy as people think. It's like walking out of your front door now and seeing the most horrendous crime happen in front of your eyes, but you've still got to go about your everyday normal business while processing all of that emotion. You can't get it out of your mind. It just plays over and over and over in your head. You literally end up with PTSD, where a bright light, a loud noise, a knock or a touch will make you jump. It will make you angry, aggressive, irritable. And it can come on over a number of days, or it can come on immediately. I have a word for it. I call it trauma shock. Drop shock, really, like the army. It's just basic trauma drop. You dropped in the middle of all of this trauma with no coping skills and expected to handle all of that without any, care in the world. And that just, human beings just don't process information that way. Getting over it and talking about it are two very different things. Talking about it, coming forward with it, is probably one of the very first steps. And you may have spent a year or 20 years yourself trying to come up with answers for all of those questions that you have, and they just lead to more questions. How can one person have more than one event? Well, it's different for each of us. Some people will go their entire life, birth to grave, never have an experience it with the paranormal whatsoever. Other people will have consistent paranormal experiences, maybe with one genre of activity, phenomenon, one kind of. And there are other people who tune in to different beings at different times in their lives. Not all of the incidents are scary, but that doesn't matter. Even if it's not scary, you've witnessed an impossible thing, and that brings all of that trauma with it, you know? And is there a connection between UFOs and cryptids? Now, in the beginning of my research, I didn't think there was. I didn't think anything. I thought everything was like compartmented. There was a box for UFOs, and there was a box for cryptids, and there was a box for the paranormal, you know? And it was all neatly filed away like that, and that really is not the truth. You need to get all of that paperwork and roll it up in a big ball and throw it up in the air and then put it all back together and keep rolling it up, because that's how it is for some people. I do believe if you've had experiences in early childhood, some of them might not even come to the core until you're in your 40s, it's different for all people. But I think that that's a person who is consistently tuning in and seeing the peripheral world around us. I honestly believe that UFOs and cryptids are moving around us all of the time, like spirit, because they're energy. And every now and again, we get a glimpse into that. If you remember, I shared a story of Paul Moran. He was a 10-year-old boy, lived in Leigh in Lancashire on the mining land there. And his friend dared him to run down to the farmer's gate. And as he was, ready to do this, he saw what he thought was a cigarette glowing in a dark field. And he realised that it wasn't someone smoking, somebody, really tall smoking. And as he was processing that event, he looks across, and next to the gate, there's this animalistic, alien like being. He's a 10-year-old boy, he's not much bigger than him. And he stared at it, and it stared at him. And he'd had experiences with lightning coming through the house. He'd also seen, UFOs, and he'd seen this kind of cryptid creature. And he said that there was an old Unexplained magazine, if people remember. And he'd said that I think it was 4 or 5 types of aliens had been drawn in it, giving an example. And one of them looked very much like what he saw. So he's, to this day, he doesn't know. And he just remembers saying to himself, wow, I saw an alien. There's a report at Stonehenge where a craft comes in, and a man and a woman in the car there. They see a humanoid type hairy figure that comes walking from where that craft is. I remember a case in Kent, similar thing, where people in the park saw some really bright lights. And from that area of those lights, they described something with very big shoulders that had skin almost hairy like a mole kind of thing, that walking upright on 2 legs. So yeah, there are lots of reports. That's just me, thinking out loud. There are lots and lots of reports that combined a cryptid-like being or humanoid being with a UFO or missing time or a bright light in the sky event. I think that all strange activity is connected. As I say, I believe someone wants to explain it to me as the quantum world around us. And that works because there are many worlds moving around us at the same time. The Fae is one I forgot to mention earlier. And I call it my peripheral because sometimes I can tune into it because I will catch it out of the peripheral of my vision, and then I will consciously tune into that energy and see what I can pick up. And like I say, it can happen to anybody at any time, anywhere. Ordinary people see UFO every day. Our next case comes from an area close to me. You heard me mention it many times, and that is the strange and wonderful Winter Hill. Felix Brown, who's one of our listeners, sent me his experience. And he said, "Hi, Deborah. I'm a big fan of your podcast, and a lot of the discussion around Winter Hill and Rivington Pike, Rivington Gardens that you've had on your recent episode has prompted me to get in touch. It's only a brief UFO sighting, but I feel it's an additional story that may be of some small interest to people. I live in Goulburn, near Warrington. Some may say Wigan, but that's another story. I know where you're coming from there, Felix. Rivington is a favourite place of mine. I love spending time in the area, and the steep hike all the way up to the Pike's amazing. I've had quite a few paranormal experiences throughout my life. I've spent a lot of time at Rivington over the years, but I can honestly say I've never experienced anything unusual in that area. That morning changed in late April, early May 2025, when I was driving along the M6 early one morning, and I happened to glance across at Winter Hill. And when I did a massive double take. As I looked away for the first time, I thought to myself, "Oh, that's cool. There's a helicopter hovering over Winter Hill." But in that split second, that assumption made no sense to me at all. I mean, when do you ever see an aircraft hovering over Winter Hill? I thought. The other thing that made no sense is that second instant I looked at it was the scale of it. The helicopter I thought I'd seen was massive. I mean, the size of it made no sense. If you look at the hill from a distance, then this object was easily a third of the width of the hill's summit. It was not a helicopter. When I looked back for the second time, what I could actually see was a long, black, kind of cigar-shaped object, but it was pointed at each end, almost like a rugby ball that's been stretched so far out that it's got to the point where it's almost, but not quite flat, if that makes sense. I'd assumed it was an helicopter, as it was at that downward angle a helicopter sits at when it first takes off, when it dips its nose. Only this object wasn't moving. It was just hovering there, not moving, quite static over the hill. The other thing I observed was that it didn't appear to be a solid object as such. It kind of looked fuzzy. Imagine scribbling back and forth, that kind of cigar shape, with a really soft, blunt pencil and really rough paper. That's the kind of texture that it had. I only got to look at this object the second time for a brief few seconds before my line of sight was obstructed by trees, etc. Remember, I'm flying down the motorway at 70 miles an hour. I realised that I didn't get an uninterrupted view and an endless amount of time to draw these conclusions, but I know what I saw. Who knows, maybe somebody else saw that object over Winter Hill and got a better look at it than I did. And if they did, I'd love it if they got in touch. I would love it if they got in touch. There are a credible amount of UFOs that are spotted above the moor, particularly, and in the Rivington and Winter Hill area, Anglesart, Chorley, the whole 9 yards. You can literally draw an inverted triangle from Jodrell Bank and take one of those spokes out through Winter Hill and off to the coast in the northwest, and then do the other and go up through Todmorden and to the northeast coast, and that is a massive catchment area for UFO. Abduction stories, stories of lights. Alan Godfrey, the police officer, my husband himself, and 3 of his friends all saw a bright light that shot off above them. They actually came to after a missing time event, and 4 of them head to head in a crucifix shape on top of an old burial mound. And that light did an incredible manoeuvre and then shot off in an incredibly fast. My husband said nothing on earth moved like it. And if you ask him about the event, he repeats that sentence consistently. Nothing on earth looked like it. And just like Jay, one of the guys that he was with when he saw it, he's watched the skies his entire life. He's got a photograph of a UFO that was above our house, and it's incredible. You can see the lights around it. And he's just an ordinary working guy. He's a decorator, painter and decorator. I know so many people that see and experience them. And now it's got much easier to make a report when you see a UFO or a UAP or something in the sky. A little like in the beginning, people who came forward in the Victorian ages and spoke of spirit, the paranormal, absolutely ridiculed. It was the same in the 70s and the 80s with UFO abductees. They were absolutely ridiculed. Now, thankfully, all these years on, we're much more understanding of that. And it's starting to be like that for the cryptid witnesses. And that's how we're beginning to realise that people have more than one kind of experience in life. Because not only did I think that these subjects were boxed off, most investigators out there will find that they only work 1 or 2 of those subjects. It's very rare that you'll find an investigator who will take on any subjects and, just run at it like I do. Some feel that you're not a legitimate investigator if you don't just stick to one subject. But could you imagine if I'd only done that? If I'd only ever taken Bigfoot reports, I'd never have any answers. I'd still be climbing the wall trying to work out what was going on. It's easy for me to say that I accept that things out there are unknown and I'll never have the answers, because I was absolutely like Jane, probably far worse than Jane. The trauma that I experienced from that event when I was 15 stayed with me for a very long time. It took me till I was nearly 40 to get my act together. I'm glad that I did. And that was because I met somebody else, my husband, who'd been through a different kind of trauma, but recognised the same fear in me that he had himself. He still fears that event. I think that's why we go up there week in, week out. I think that's his way of processing what went on, and mine. That's what we do. If we can go up there and be in a dark woodland, nothing happens. We can be in the car watching the sky and nothing happens. It gives you that little bit of stability, doesn't it? But always at the back of your mind is that feeling of, I know that there's more than this. And how do you carry on an absolutely normal life with that? It's really easy for me to be like a guru and say balance, and everything. I don't know. You have to find a way to navigate it yourself, and that's a straight up truth. There ain't no mixing that or messing that up or giving in that in any way that's, softer or kinder. You just have to find a way to navigate it. The struggle to come to terms with these events was felt very strongly by our next witness, Mark, and he shares his experiences with me in a number of WhatsApp messages. His name's Mark Sylvester, and his experience took place when he was a young boy. Mark Sylvester said, for the most part, things started early on with paranormal type experiences for me, Deb. For example, I'd regularly hear my father, who I was absolutely terrified of, shouting my name, to which I would always immediately shout out in answer, for fear of consequences, only to be presented with my father either not being there in the home or totally unaware that I was there at all. To other extremes, where when I witnessed an old late 1960s radio slide itself forward off the mantelpiece and drop onto the fireplace and break open, and of course I was not believed when I tried to explain what happened. And then I was beaten for lying, and it, as well as breaking it. There was also night visitors I'd see regularly from a very early age, and a strange silhouette, a very small figure that seemed to float towards the bedroom window. It was always backlit by a very bright light. I don't mind sharing what happened, Deb, though now I can clearly see the changes in myself when I look back over the years. I started out in complete denial, even abandoning my friend who was also there with me, just so they wouldn't think I was mad. I think it took place in 1982 when the Americans invaded Grenada. My mum and sister had gone to see family there, leaving me and my dad at home. I do regret that now, but as an 11-year-old, peer pressure's everything. So from about the age of 9, I'd wander off onto the neighbouring, rugby ground, which had a few trees at the farthest end that surrounded the local bus corporation depot. I was in a state now. I was a latchkey kid, as I had my younger sibling and I attended the same school on days when both parents were on an afternoon shift. I would have let us in, heated up the food for tea. My elder brother was off doing whatever, wasn't missed, to be honest. It was a relief as much as my dad not being there, not having him, my big brother in the house. My sister would stay at the house with friends. They'd come round and I'd always end up wandering off on my own. I'd be gone for hours on end, and in the holidays all day if I could. So I was used to my own company and began making friends with a couple of local boys who were, looked down on because their parents were on benefits. So how much, I or we would have been seen to be believable, I think that's doubtful back then, Deb. These events must have taken place over the whole day. It started in the morning when I was wandering around the rugby club looking for damson trees, plums, apple trees that grew at the back of the houses around the 5-acre grounds. It would have been about 10 a.m, cloudless, but it was a brisk morning and there was just one single fluffy cloud, unmoving, in a perfectly blue clear sky. That's weird, It was roughly as much as I thought about it, to be honest. And I went on foraging, as they call it now. As I think of it, soon after this, my time in the morning would have been taken up with taking the goat out and pegging it out on a good spot for the day. The rugby club let us do this as it saved them spending the summer, skies and all that, cutting it every 4 weeks. But at this time, I wasn't doing this, so I think 1982 is about right, and by then I was about 12. I think I'd bought some cheap kids' binoculars the day before, and as kids do, I'd taken to you look at everything through them, don't you? On this morning, I'm looking out at the aeroplanes flying over at high altitude, and I'm noticing the reflection of the sun off the bright aluminium bodies. not something you'd see today with the different materials they used. I was also very into Tomorrow's World, which I recorded featured a new microlight aircraft, which I think had clear plastic membrane over the wings, if I can remember right. But quite a bit later that morning, the kids had arrived on the rugby field, and the holidays, it was like our own private park. We'd thrown jumpers down for goalposts, and the inevitable footy game had begun. As usual, the sound of a ball being kicked and screaming kids attracted more kids, and soon we had a five-a-side. I still had my binoculars, and not really being into footy anyway. I'd simply boot it as far as I could in order to take a look at something, which they'd obviously cottoned onto, as I was getting left out of the game more and more. During this time, I'm looking at the horizon, to the west of us. There's a small, low-flying plane, as I thought, and it's rising from the roof line of the far-off houses, and apparently heading directly to the only cloud in the sky. And as I looked in the binoculars, it appeared to be a delta-shaped kind of translucent wing. I assumed at the time I was witnessing a new microlight in action, and I was quite chuffed that I'd managed to catch it, and watching on and while playing, trying to play the game and still track its progress. On reflection, thinking back, it was pretty swift. It was silent and direct. I mean, there was no deviation that I could see. I saw that as it reached the cloud, it appeared to turn on its headlights. I just assumed it must be like drivers do when there's fogging, around your car. But it were a clear sky. It would have been far easier to just avoid it, because it was clearly visible. It entered the cloud and the light faded. I waited for it to emerge while playing, checking around to see if I'd missed it. I didn't see it for over 20 minutes. The game kind of fizzled out. Kids went off for lunch, and I went foraging again. Sometime later, I'm not sure when exactly, kids are back on the field, and the ball's out, and we resume where we left off. I then saw a similar craft come from the east of our position and follow a similar trajectory towards a single cloud. And again, it appeared clear through the binoculars. It was translucent and like a delta shape. So another microlight, I thought. I stopped playing. I just watched it turn on its light, enter the cloud, and the light fade out. It didn't emerge. The cloud never moved. In fact, it was a very still day and quite warm in that sun. I think I mentioned what I'd seen to the other kids. No one seemed interested at all. So we went about foraging, eating. We decided we'd make jam, or apple pie, something like that, with some of the fruit we'd collected. So later that day, there's just two of us left, and it's towards sunset. Just as now, I watched as the orange light began to reflect on that single cloud that had that same kind of longing feeling. This was when, while talking to my friend, who was about 3 years younger than me, he'd been about 9, and he was still able to spin around the rails on the pitch. And as I watched him, I noticed lights inside the cloud that looked to be moving around within it. It looked more stunning with the orange, Again, a strong feeling of familiarity with this sight came over me. And I just watched, you know, and carried on speaking. Now, here's the tricky bit to explain. The lights seemed to join together inside the cloud, and they got much brighter. And then the cloud began to dissolve. The single bright light moved slowly and silently lower in the sky. And it's now very much twilight, and I'm not sure how come that's happened so quickly. And then I'm suddenly struck with the notion that a large aeroplane is about to fly super low above us. And I and my friend feel compelled to wait to see this. Suddenly, I'm aware it's now dark, no longer twilight. The light has now dropped down to about twice the height of the rugby stand, about 6 metres maybe in height. The single white light goes off. Just as I'm thinking should be seeing red and green lights, they appear. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And it dawns on me that there's too many lights for it to be a plane. and there's no sound. The next thing we see is the underside of a grey-green craft, a saucer-like craft, but with the same texture and segmentation as a clam. In fact, I was able to see the lights were not attached to it. They were simply staying in position around it as they were translucent. There was an energy in the air as it cleared the end of the corporation land and the workshops, and we could see it was wider than the rugby stand opposite. We were kind of in shock for a while. The next bits of memory are disjointed to me. They feel off. I can see clearly the face of my friend and the shock on it, and he seems to register that same look on me, and we just start to run. And then we immediately, and without thought, stop running. But it feels like I've hit the ground too hard for some reason, and that craft is now to the north of us, just passing silently over the houses that border the rugby pitch. And then the craft suddenly and silently shoots off towards Sheffield, which is north of us. He ran to the street light at the end of the rugby club to try and work out what just happened. I remember walking down around the roadway, to go home. The day after, my friend showed me a picture of what, he drew what we saw. His drawing was of a saucer, or two, on top of each other, with red and green lights around the edges. He drew it from the side, which at the time I thought made it wrong. But having seen my own kids now, I realise it's quite common as we're looking at things from a different perspective, I think it's because I never went through the kind of stick man or face with arms and legs that you do, that phase in drawing. I just drew with perspective from the beginning and outlined what I saw. The sky met the ground, the clouds were just left the colour on the page. Why wouldn't you? Well, we're not all artistic. I am still in the stick and thing. I'm not kidding, I am. For some reason, for days after seeing that UFO, I was drawn to go to my sister's room, which I never really did before. And I'd just look, standing on the bed, look in the direction that the object had been. It would not have been possible to see it, because the house was full 3 floors below the level of the rugby ground, which itself is opposite a very old church. As I looked looking out, I sort of knew something was there and was unsurprised to see 2 craft silently passing, one behind the other, one higher than the other slightly. They appeared whitish cream and resembled kind of, like 2 Tic Tacs stuck offset about halfway along each other. And they were joined at that point. They had like an upper and a lower section. And they moved, only going about walking pace, and with a red light again. It wasn't fastened, but it was in position to the rear of the upper section. And it was phasing on and off over a 2-second repeating cycle. So it'd go from on to off to on, as if to attract my attention. Their position, though, next to the main Sheffield Road, as it was then, was probably close to 1/8 of a mile back. And as the road was on a hill, about the same up in the air, but with the orange high-pressure sodium lights we had then, and the glare, you wouldn't have seen through that glare. And they seemed to pass over the large house at the top, lingering at the rear, moving extremely slowly. I observed them and thought, what do you want? They both seemed to respond by stopping, and a feeling of calm came over me. I must have seen them for about a minute or so when they put on a green light at the front lower section and began moving off across the road, just above the poplar trees, which would say 30 feet or so on the rugby pitch side, but by the church. It was 50 foot up easily as they passed over between the church and the council houses, and then it's accelerating rapidly and noiselessly. In the distance, I could hear jet engines, and within a minute, 2 extremely low jets passed along on the same trajectory. I climbed down and retained this kind of calm feeling. There was only me in. It was about 4, half 5, something like that. And I'd gone upstairs to get changed out of my uniform when I was got drawn to go and have a look. Another definite thing I recall after this was one day soon afterwards, I think either a school holiday or a weekend. I got on a bike from Woolworths that year, so it might have been some time after October, which was my birthday, as I recall the bike, and it still looked like I had originally because I eventually changed everything on that bike. It was a foggy day, just kind of that visible dome that surrounded everything, about 10 meters thick. It wasn't bright, but not that dark either, so probably about 3 o'clock. I'd been walking in the fog before fetching my bike, and I was drawn to look up. And when I did, I observed what I could only describe as kind of a multicoloured shimmer in the fog, like a kind of green, blue, yellowish, orange, deep purple, reddish colour. It reminded me of the effect you get when, you're looking at oil and water at just the right angle and you get that prismatic effect. As I became aware of it, a streak shot down and it briefly looked like the fire pattern, used on the Hot Wheels toy cars at the time. It was there less than a second and then it just dispersed. Before this, when we lived at the other house, I'd wake up with the night terrors and all I could recall was a green glowing liquid and a dark round room. It'd be lit very dimly and from no point that I could see. It just seemed like the air was lit and it had this warm to touch material, not like plastic or metal, it looked like ceramic, but with an almost non-stick appearance and no texture when you touched it. There was also things being moved into my way by beings that I could not see. I would have been 2 to 3 at the time, but each night, as my cot was in front of the window, I can recall a person's silhouette which would appear brightly and it'd be backlit and it'd get bigger and bigger until he appeared stood in the window, at which point I'd pass out. When I went back to look at this house, I saw it was a railway house of the early 1800s and the windows were all incredibly small, no more than 4 feet. I'd imagined that I'd been seeing the shadow of a night worker, on the rail lines that ran above the house at the rear. But I looked on Google Maps at the line, and the angles needed to cast a shadow. I saw some right discrepancies. The most obvious was that the white light is always shown on the front of a train to indicate the direction, just like cars. And the closer the light gets, the bigger the shadow would get till it filled the light and blocked it. That shadow would also have moved sideways as it got closer, and it did none of this. That must have been absolutely terrifying, growing up with that every night in your bedroom as a child. And each of the witnesses we've heard from tonight have some knowledge of that, It is absolutely terrifying. I knew that when that light hit the windowsill, as I call it, then everything would kick off and I was about to go through a night of terror again. I don't know, I'd just try anything to get to sleep before that time so that I didn't have to tolerate it. And I'm still going through it and I'm 58. And the same night terrors, same questions, and we all do. Regardless of the experience that you've had, no matter who you are, you're going to deal with it in your own way. And for some, that means doing actions that you wouldn't normally consider yourself would normally do. That's what trauma does to a person. It can change so much about you because it literally changes your whole world. It's like, as I said earlier, walking out the front door and a catastrophic something happens and your world is never the same again. You will always have before the incident and after the incident. And if you're one of the unfortunate ones who has more than one incident, then that gets sectioned in the same kind of way. We get very good at compartmentalizing things because that's what we learn as children. Because all of us had some kind of trauma going on in the home around us, or were bullied at school. There was always trauma involved, and you learn to pull yourself away from that. And that's, I think, is a common thread between most of us witnesses. I do have some more personal experiences exactly like this. And I'm going to sit down tonight and I'm also going to voice those so that we can follow them on. Because I think it's a thread that we do need to look at, is this connection between the fear, the friend or foe, and the seeing things as a child, or even fearing things as a child, that you have this inbuilt fear of something. Deb Singleton said that she was terrified of wolves, even though she had no reason to be. And I've always, UFO or ET or anything like that has always given me like an absolute rage. And like, I rage against it. I don't even understand it. And that's why I wake up fighting, I think. To the point that when I've had a hospital operations, it literally had to speak to the doctor and say, if you shine that light in my face, she will shout, she'll wake up and she'll be swinging. So I have to have extra sedation for it. It's just so clearly something happened to me when I was a child with a bright light above me. That's probably the first time I've voiced that in 58 years. But that's what it's like being a witness to the unknown. There's no roadmap, unfortunately. So I shall be joining you again next week, and I will bring you some more stories exactly like this from British people in the UK who witness the most extraordinary things in the sky. And until that time, good night, everyone.